gay liberation were pro-feminist. They criticized sex roles such as butch and femme. They criticized sadomasochism and so on. And they were all really different from queer politics. So queer politics was a backlash against that earlier radicalism. And I explained that the theory that came out of queer politics, much of it created by lesbians such as Judith Butler, promoted the idea that queer, which was never well defined, that gender, which was never well defined, was something that was exciting to play with, whereas feminists said that we actually have to get rid of gender, and so on. And in the book, I examine the politics of public sex, sadomasochism, the main forms in which gay men's sexuality was expressed at the time, or the forms which they most admired in their culture. After gay liberation, I think gay liberation was a little different. So I think the years of the early 70s, there was a lot of criticism of all the things that became embedded in and seen as the vital parts of gay male sexuality later on. So I understand queer politics and gay male politics generally after gay liberation as being about the sexual liberation of gay male sexuality. And it's been very, very problematic for lesbians and feminists because, of course, pornography is vital and fundamental to gay male culture. I mean, really, really, really fundamental, as is the promotion of prostitution. Prostitution was very often a way that gay men came out, and it's been very functional for very many gay men. I know there's been a few critics, but very, very few. Gay men don't really speak out against these practices. Paedophilia, for instance, was absolutely promoted in the 1970s in male gay organizations around Europe and in the US and so on. I don't think that's changed. They don't say much about paedophilia now, but about sadomasochism, pornography, and all those forms of aggressive hypermasculinity, those are still fundamental, I think, to gay male culture, and they're certainly not criticized.
I mean, you talk about, like, the way gay male sexuality is constructed, and I've always thought it was like, it's based on male socialization. Male sexuality is just sexualized male socialization, but what is the specific problem of the way gay male sexuality is constructed over and above the fact that it's male socialization?
It is fundamentally typical traditional traditional heterosexual male sexuality. Of course, that's where it's modeled from. Male sexuality comes from the same place, which is that it's the eroticizing of dominance because they're in a power position in relation to women. So male sexuality is constructed out of the power relationship between men and women, and therefore it's about men being able to express their power and aggression and remain in a position of control in relation to subordinates. The problem for gay men is that they often see themselves and are brought up to see themselves as not really masculine because they're not in the male ruling class in as much as they don't subordinate women directly. The difficulty with that is that often gay men grow up with a masochistic sexuality in which they see themselves as therefore in some way feminine, because femininity and women are the default position. If you're not masculine, you don't make it to the male ruling class, then somehow you're related to women. So a huge swathe of gay male culture and sexuality is about talking about their sexuality in terms of men and women, tops and bottoms, and feeling like women when they're penetrated. It's about drag, which is mocking women in terrible ways. So unfortunately, masochism is very front and central in gay male sexual politics because of this problem from male supremacy of not seeing themselves as in the dominant class. They love the dominant class because for the most part gay male sexuality is, as we'll see later on, about worshipping and loving hypermasculinity in men. So in that sense they love the masculinity of the ruling class, but in the sense that they don't see themselves as matching up to that often.
Yeah, I mean, they got into that whole hypermasculine thing, and I remember seeing that happen. But all of a sudden there was a jump to queer theory. I mean, did they create hypermasculinity, motivated by queer theory, or was it just, they're escaping homophobia, it's all about sex? I mean, how did that hypermasculine sexuality, where did it come from? How did it jump, or how did they get to use queer theory?
Queer theory obviously came from queer politics. There wasn't queer theory before queer politics developed, and queer politics developed in the early 1990s in the US. Queer was not a word that was really used much in Britain. It was particularly male, and it was particularly US. Queer politics is usually seen as having developed from the AIDS crisis. Gay men were resisting and answering back to the way in which they saw themselves as oppressed and discriminated against because of AIDS. So they developed this sort of resistant, in-your-face politics of saying, we are queer. We're here, we're queer, get used to it, all of those slogans and so on. The problem was that queer was never really used for lesbians, and immediately queer politics developed, lesbians were completely left out and excluded because, for decades before the 1990s, we had been struggling as lesbians to get the word lesbian into anything, to ensure that if there was a gay conference, it had the word lesbian there. If there was a book about gay, it had the word lesbian there, because we knew that the generic terms of gay, homosexual, and so on did not cover women. Well, suddenly a generic term was forced upon us. And what happened quite quickly was that something had to be done to describe women who were in this sort of queer lot. And so we were called queer women. Lesbians became queer women because lesbians were obviously not excluded. Another term, a descriptor, had to be used to explain why there'd been women there at all. So it was a terrible backlash in that sense, in terms of disappearing women and creating a huge promotion in public of the gay male sexual revolution. I don't think that gay male politics came from there. The gay male sexual politics came from there because, of course, historically, gay male sexual politics have been about a sort of exaggeration, because of course there aren't women to limit what they're able to do, an exaggeration of the politics of male dominant sexuality.